now for something completely different, as they say. If Andrew's here, there must be some scary new piece of legislation to worry about. Last time I spoke at UKNOF, it was the Investigatory Powers Act. This time it's the General Data Protection Regulation. The good news is this isn't as scary as that was, but I hope it's still worth paying attention, maybe. Give you a clue what's coming down the line fairly soon now. So what is it? It's a new European law, has already been passed. It was created May 2016, but with an implementation date of 25th of May next year, 2018. There's about, depending how you print it out, 85 pages that already exist. So you'd think maybe that those 85 pages would tell you everything you needed to know. Unfortunately, not true, because there are about 50 areas for each member state to make its own mind up about. UK government has said it will publish a data protection bill soon. I checked last night and it wasn't yet up. If anybody wants to have a look at parliament.org.uk and tell me if it's there at the moment. But I'm told it will be debated before the party conferences. So that should be in the next couple of weeks. The other major problem is that although the regulators... Is there any way I can stop the ringing slightly? Or is it okay? Anyway, maybe only me that's hearing it. Although, that's better, thank you. Although the regulators told us back in 2016 that 2 years was not long, get on with implementing it, they themselves have been, very slow in producing the guidance we need. So there are some major pieces of guidance that they're not expecting to produce until December or January, leaving us, 4 to 5 months to implement something that they were expecting to take most of 2 years. Not helpful. However, it would be tempting to say, okay, fine, let's wait and see what comes out in January. I would recommend not doing that, because there are at least 3 areas where the direction of change is already clear, and actually what we need to do is pretty clear, at least at the high level, and then if we do how we're approaching it at Jisc is we are doing the high-level stuff now so that all that is done by January. So when the guidance does come out on the detail, we can spend all of our time on implementing the guidance, not on still doing stuff that we could have done before. So 3 main areas. There's a significantly wider definition of what is personal data. And this is a law that regulates personal data, so it's going to regulate a lot more than it used to. In particular for us as network operators, it's now clear that anything attached to an IP address, a MAC address, or an email address is going to be covered by this. The old discussion of, is an IP address personal data? Yeah, it is, except in very weird circumstances. There's been a case that even said that website logs associated with a dynamic IP address were still personal data because it was possible legally to link back to the individual. So I'm afraid we are in scope for this. One, it looks a fairly big change to me, is that rather than previous data protection legislation, including our own UK Act, have kind of said, well, describe what you're doing, and then it's up to individuals whether they want to use your service or not. This now changes that to require a lot more thinking by organizations. Can you actually justify what you're doing? And then, yes, we still have to tell individuals, but there is a shift from individuals choosing, in theory, what they agree to organizations actually being responsible for what they themselves do. So that seems to me, this is one area where I think you can do a lot of preparation, and it takes a long time, since we're in the middle of it at Jisc, is rather than the old style information asset register of, you look at all the hard disks and you say what personal data are on there, and then you say, right, this is what we've got, pretty much job done, there's our asset register. You need to look at the whole information life cycle. Where does this information come from? Why have we got it? When are we disposing of it? So that's one area I'd certainly suggest concentrating some effort now if you're not already doing so. The other one is that consent, which certainly some internet organizations have regarded as a get-out-of-jail-free card. We told the user what we're going to do, we're doing it. Therefore, we have consent, therefore, carry on. A lot of that is, at least in the wording of the legislation, much more tightly defined. Whether regulators will actually go with what the law says and actually go to organizations and say, no, that is not valid consent, I don't know. As a data subject, I really hope they do, but they haven't shown much appetite for it in the past. But I think, at least in preparation for this, there are 5 other justifications for processing. And if you think you're relying on consent to do something, have a look at the other 5 and see whether they're actually a better fit. Because I think there will be questions raised somewhere about, is that consent really valid? So, looking in more detail at the last 2 of those, the information life cycles and the legal justifications. Life cycles. This is my picture of an information life cycle, as approved by records management people. What you do with data, you collect it, you use it for something, and then you dispose of it. No, really, you dispose of it. At some point, you should be getting rid of information. Each of those in turn, the sorts of questions you should be asking to collect the information that you'll need for implementing the regulation. Collection stage, why are we collecting this? What's it for? Is it customer data we need to be able to bill them? We can't send them a bill unless we've got a postal address. Fine. What data do we need? How do we send out bills? Electronically, phone, post, all good reasons, but start from why we're doing it, then what data do we need? Who do we get it from? Do we get it direct from the individual, which is the simple case, because then as you collect it, you can tell the individual what you're going to do with it? Or do you get it indirectly? Do you get it from somewhere else, which looks a bit tricky? One of the things we do when connecting up universities is we say, okay, please will you nominate a security contact, a management contact. We're probably talking to the technical contact already, but we collect those 3. But we get all of those from one person. So initially it starts sounding a bit tricky of, okay, so how do we contact the other 2 to let them know what's going on? But actually, if somebody has typed in somebody else's email address into a form, you probably want to send a message to that email address anyway to check it's working. So getting into the habit of, okay, we've been given this email address by somebody, let's send a message to it and see if it bounces. And a scary number of ours do. And at that point, you can provide the information that you're required to. We've got the data, what do we do with it? Processing. Again, why are we processing? What's the purpose of this? How are we processing? Where? How do we keep it secure? Security, actually the requirements in the regulation haven't changed all that much. What there is more detail, and the detail looks really good to me. It looks like good practice, the sort of thing we'd be doing anyway. It mentions things like encryption. It mentions things like authorization, not handing out your key to too many people. So I think on the security side, it's actually quite positive. So that's the processing bit. Then, when we no longer need it, and I think for nearly all data, there will be a genuine, we no longer need this. Colleagues have a project to look at data held by higher education organizations and further education to say, okay, how long do you actually need this? One of the interesting ones is exposure to ionizing radiation, which is personal data that is required to be kept for longer than life, because it might actually affect your descendants. If you've been in a lab that used radioactive substances, it's possible your descendants might want to know about that. So that one, there is a long retention time, but there's still there is still some retention time. Other stuff much shorter, for securing networks, for doing incident response. 3 to 6 months was agreed a long time ago with the Information Commissioner, and still feels about right because we haven't actually got much better at detecting incidents. When we dispose of things, how do we do it? Do we just delete it? Good, that's disposed. Aggregate, so turning stuff into statistics. A lot of colleagues are interested in statistics about the use of the network. Fine, keep those as long as you like, just get rid of the source IP addresses. So this organization over time, this is what its history of traffic looks like, no problem at all. So aggregate in various ways. There is an interesting sort of slight eyebrow raise that I read in the regulation about anonymize, because anonymized data has actually looked like a get out of jail free card in data protection legislation going right back to the mid-80s. So if it's anonymized, it's no longer personal data. Increasingly, the nasty academics have come up with ways of de-anonymizing stuff that you thought was anonymized. So any sort of record with a significant number of fields in it may well turn out to be unique, even if you've deleted the name, the email address, the IP address, all the sort of traditional identifiers. And so there's actually increasingly been a pushback that this idea of anonymization, is it ever possible? If you've got a decently long record, what is the history of websites that this particular IP address looked at? That could well be unique, and could well tell us things about the individual, even once you've got rid of the IP address. So there is now an explicit requirement. In the past, it's been an unease that if you are using anonymization, then you need to keep an eye on the state of the art of de-anonymization. So keep reviewing the risk of re-identification. Suppose a large credit bureau were to have a leak of large quantities of personal data, now, could the possessor of that information use that in connection with the data we're holding that we declare to be anonymous? Could that external data set suddenly allow re-identification? So I'm almost tempted to say that deletion or aggregation are better, because at least then you know what the risk is and it's a risk you can manage. So disposal, tricky. But again, plan for it, know when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it. So you end up with different questions across your life cycle. At the collection stage, why are we collecting the data? What are we collecting? Who are we collecting it from? Process stage, why are we collecting how? Disposal, when and how. And once you've got that set of answers to questions, I think you're going to be in a really good place to answer the questions that the regulation poses and to do what it says you need to. Because having got at those got this slide. That's a 3-stage, a nice simple information lifecycle model. There are a couple of extras because sometimes we either share information with other people. So I'm using the term share where this is kind of an agreement, it's an ongoing relationship. Either externally with a partner organization, do we need to provide statistics or information to somebody else, the regulator or whatever, or additional uses inside. I'd suggest treating these as a share process and then starting a new life cycle for that new internal process, now answering the same set of questions. Externally, you probably need to look at having some sort of data sharing agreement, because legally you will continue to have some responsibility for what goes on. So agreeing before you share data what those responsibilities are, who will satisfy them. Interestingly, there was a lot of fuss a couple of months back about a deal between a major hospital and Google, that they were providing patient data so that Google could throw artificial intelligence algorithms at it. And actually, if you look at the Information Commissioner's criticisms of this, one of the major criticisms is that there wasn't an agreement beforehand. So you could almost read the ICO large critical document as saying you did the things in the wrong order. Now, what you did could have been lawful, but because of the lack of this information, this agreement to wrap around it, probably wasn't. I'm distinguishing that from disclose, which probably the most familiar one is Section 29 request, where law enforcement come and say, please can you provide us with some of the personal data you have in order for us to do a criminal investigation. Here, if you agree to hand over the data, you hand over the data. Your responsibility for what happens after that is terminated. So the most common example is disclosing to law enforcement. This one you don't want to do by a data sharing agreement. You want to say, we're getting rid of it. The way to do that is to find something in the law which says you can do this, and at this point your responsibility ends. And in the regulation there certainly is the equivalent of the current Section 29. So disclosure to law enforcement will, I expect, look quite similar. There might be different numbers on the form. So that's the information lifecycle stuff. The two why questions in there get interesting for the justifications for processing. As I say, there are 6. It's, to my mind, one of the big mistakes in the whole of data protection law was that consent is always listed first. And I think a lot of processors have just read that and gone, yes, we have consent from the individual. In some sort of common language term, the individual has agreed to this. Therefore, we don't need to read any further. You know, I have been told, for example, that I pay my taxes by consent. I wish. If so, I withdraw the consent now. Please, can I have at least 7 years' money back? I've also been told that school children consent to having their names taken on the daily register. I mean, that's ludicrous on so many bases. Somebody certainly under 13 can't give valid consent anyway. And you know, a pupil sitting in a classroom is not in a position to refuse to have their name on the register. So consent is just wrong for that. So look at the other 5. They all start with necessary. So you have to say, okay, we have, if you're saying necessary for contract, we have some sort of agreement. I have agreed to provide you with a service. To bill you, I need some way of contacting you. So postal address, email address, whatever, is necessary for the purpose of that agreement. Contract sounds scary. You tend to think of things written in blood on dead animal. It doesn't have to be. In English law, a contract is pretty much any sort of agreement between us. So I have offered, a supermarket has offered to sell me a product by putting it on the shelf. I have agreed to buy it at the price offered by turning up at the counter and being willing to pay for it. That's a contract. No paper involved. Necessary for law. We are required by law to do some things. For example, my employer is required to do various processing in company with the tax office. That one, relatively straightforward. The law says I have to do this, I do it. Get on with it. A couple that are probably less likely to come up, particularly in this audience, occasionally they do. The first one does anyway. Necessary for vital interest is what the legislation actually says. This is the most common example, a breathing but unconscious body found in the street. I know that that person is allergic to a particular drug. If I want, I should be telling the ambulance, don't pump this into them. That's a disclosure of actually sensitive personal data. It's health data about them, but it's necessary to protect their life, to protect their vital interest. Public interest, deeply unclear what this one is about. Different views from regulators, particular interest to universities who are being left in a great lack of clarity about whether what they do is public interest or legitimate interest. But one of the regulatory ideas of public interest was if somebody else has a legal requirement to do something and you want to help them. So tax office are required to process personal data for tax purposes. If you know about a fraud, there may not be a legal obligation on you to report it, but if you do, then the transfer of information can be based on necessary public interest. And then the one that I think, although there are some privacy enthusiasts, let's say, who think it should be struck from the law entirely. As a data subject, I find this one actually the most comforting because it gives the regulator most things to bite on, is necessary in the legitimate interest of an organisation. The one that's explicit in the regulation is that processing personal data to secure a network is necessary in the legitimate interest of the network. And I actually say, and the users of the network or the system. Because if my personal data is on a computer and somebody is processing other personal data, logs and things to protect that personal data, well, that's in my interest too, not just the organization's. So I'd have a look at that one. The additional test on, okay, right, good. The additional test on legitimate interest is you have to check that the organization's interest is not overridden by the interest of the individuals. For many things that is relatively straightforward, for some things that will be hard. You know, when I look at the things for which it's hard, I'm thinking, yeah, that's because those things are questionable. So I like that test as a data subject, and I don't find it too problematic as a network operator of network services, former security person. And then there's consent. Consent is the only one where the regulation does not contain the word necessary. And actually, given the constraints that are now put on consent, you must not be under pressure to give consent. Consent does not work when there is an imbalance of power. I'm almost thinking that consent only works where something is not necessary. So internally, I'm suggesting, okay, if you think you're processing this based on consent, does it matter if I lie? If I give you false data and say, my name is Harry Potter, I'm a 17-year-old wizard, does your service still work? Now, if your service still works, then your collection of Harry Potter, 17-year-old wizard probably is based on consent. If your service doesn't, I'd go and look for one of the other 5. The only ones we've found for consent are if you want to fill in a questionnaire, if you want to put a profile picture on your person page, and so on. Almost nothing relating to services. So I'm thinking this is actually unnecessary. And for each of these, there are different duties, different rights, different notice requirements. Again, rather more clearly set out in the new law than they were in the old. Sometimes you've got complex activities. So I mentioned, I have a blog. If you want to sign up for notifications about the blog, well, we can't send you notifications unless you give us an email. So provision of an email is necessary for the agreement. We record IP addresses, we record names of people trying to sign up and not send us comment spam, legitimate interest. If you want to be addressed by a nickname or put a picture, you make the service prettier based on consent. Things to do next, and why I think this really helps with the things to do next. The last 3, privacy notices, rights processes, subject access and consent, are all areas where we haven't yet got detailed guidance. But if you've gone through my information lifecycle audit and the legal basis for processing, then I think you're in a good place to know which of my services need which bits of that guidance and how urgently. This is my sort of project plan presentation of the Information Commissioner's 12 steps to GDPR compliance. So that's it. Now, that's your project plan. If you want to download it, it's available freely on the blog. Said, still awaiting details, guidance on privacy notice, data subject rights, consent. Maybe December, January. Maybe. The consent one was expected in May and has just been put back to December. So they are slipping badly. If necessary, we may have to implement based on the existing guidance. And that's, I have now got an end slide, which I was kind of expecting. Right, so and the next one says questions. And the question of why is your corporate picture such an old phone was asked the other week at Links. So.
Any questions? No? Okay,
right.
Thanks, Andrew.
If you have, so there are, I think there's over 100 posts on the blog. So. Great, thank you very much.